politics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is political and policy analyst Kristen Medini. Hey, Kristen.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
I'm doing okay today, actually. How about you?
I'm okay. Lovely Saturday here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we get started with all the stuff we want to get to today, I want to first thank our newest monthly supporter on Patreon, and that is Brett. So thank you so much, Brett. We appreciate your help. Also, I wanted to let everyone know that we've added some new benefits for our supporters at the fan, sustainer, and executive producer tiers on Patreon. In addition to the regular bonus show, which of course all supporters have access to, everyone at the fan level will now have access to Politics Guys Quick Takes, which is a new feature that we're starting this week. What it is essentially where we have a host who won't be on the show that week will give you their take on whatever they think mattered that week and why they think it mattered, that sort of thing. I've really been wanting to do this for a while now. There was a while back where I took a break for, I think it was 3 weeks, and it was nice to have the break, but I found myself thinking, gosh, I really wish I could comment on this at least, briefly. And so, after I asked everyone else, and everyone seemed to think that was a pretty neat idea. And so it's a little extra thing that we're offering to you. And so you can get kind of a more complete, I guess, Politics Guys take on what's going on in the week. Also, at our sustainer and executive producer tier, supporters are now getting invitations to our Politics Guys Slack group. And this is, I think, really kind of neat because you not only get a chance to go behind the scenes as we figure out what our story lineup for the week is, but you'll actually have the opportunity to offer your feedback. I think it was with Kristen, even this week when our first few folks were on, I think it was Benji and Scott had some ideas for stories, and we've been able to kind of incorporate a few things in there. So it's really kind of a neat way to actually become even more a part of the show. And not only that, but we talk about kind of the larger direction of the show, things we want to maybe try out and so forth. And so if that sounds interesting to you, you can check it out. Again, that's at the sustainer and executive producer tiers, and all that stuff you can check out at patreon.com/politicsguys. All right, with that out of the way, Kristen, I think we're ready to get going.
Yeah. So the first story is really a terrible one. Last weekend, the nation got tragic news from El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio. 2 deadly mass shootings took place. A total of 31 were killed. Dozens more were wounded. President Trump visited both American cities later in the week, drawing praise from supporters and criticism from protesters. So this entire week, the nation has seen an even deeper divide with elected officials, activists, pundits, and celebrities on both sides of the political aisle throwing barbs to the other side. And what's transpired is a conversation about things like white nationalism, whether political parties are responsible for hate and tragedies like this one. But somewhere underneath these barbs were deeper policy issues that were really begging to be discussed, and things that, we discuss from time to time when these things happen, but they don't seem to stick. And those are conversations about things like gun control, mental health, the legal system, cultural issues, and more. So it was a tough week, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And, it's almost it's a deja vu kind of thing, because I remember having so many of these conversations in past shows. And I think, everyone seems to think every time, well, this time maybe we'll be different and so forth. And I wish I could believe that, but I just don't. I think it seems to me, I guess the one thing that's maybe a little bit different here is there seems to be a tiny bit of momentum for perhaps passage of, not even passage of a red flag law nationally, but to have the federal government or Congress pass legislation that would provide some money or some incentives for states to pass their own red flag laws. And I thought, wow, that's about the weakest possible response that I could conceivably think of. And even that, I have my doubts about, because even though the NRA has in the past said, well, we're not exactly opposed to these, when those laws have actually been pushed at the state level in some states, they actually have opposed them. Basically, they want to make them as weak as possible. And so even in states that have these laws, and there are a bunch of them that have them, the effectiveness varies widely based on kind of that fine print sort of thing. And so I think the NRA maybe sees this as kind of a fig leaf sort of thing, saying, "Well, we can say that we're doing something, but that's such a tiny step that it almost is meaningless." And it's depressing and disappointing to me, but it seems to me that this is essentially the price we pay. And I would almost have a little more respect for the NRA if they said, you know what? We have a lot more guns than any other developed country. We have a lot more gun deaths, and we have a Second Amendment, and this is the price we pay for all of these freedoms, is that we're going to have thousands more people die every year. And I don't know how you can look at the data and unless you're willfully blind and not say that we have a lot more gun deaths because we have a lot more guns. And if you're willing to make that trade-off, okay, just have the stones to say, well, that's the trade-off we're willing to make. But don't try to tell me it's, well, mental health or violent video games. Oh, Walmart bans violent video game displays. That's going to help. I mean, so at least I'd like to see a little more honesty in this debate, because it's pretty clear to me we're not going to actually make any progress, at least not at the federal level.
Yeah, I went back because I remembered that there was an assault weapon ban. That was actually what it was called, and it was I couldn't remember when it was. I thought maybe it was under Clinton, and it was 94, and that of course expired after 10 years. So this expired back in 2004. But this is an issue that it's funny because we seem to talk about it every time one of these tragedies happens, and then it seems to die down a bit, and then we talk about it again and it dies down a bit. But this isn't anything new. I mean, I remember I was in high school when the Columbine shooting happened. I was a high school student when that happened, and I remember how that shook me and shook my friends. I mean, I'm sure listeners know this. I live in South Florida. I actually live about 10-15 minutes from Parkland, and I passed Marjorie Stoneman Douglas on the day that that awful tragedy happened last year.
Wow.
And I know 3 people who were affected by it. One who had a daughter who was killed. So I definitely understand that this is a conversation we need to have, but the problem with, for example, this assault weapons ban back in 94, and I think everybody agrees, most experts agree, I would say, is that it was very complex. There were lots of loopholes, and there was also, there are illegal guns that need to be taken into consideration. You can obtain these guns illegally, but there were so many loopholes that, were they effective? Were they not effective? There's really no data to show one way or the other. And so it's been largely forgotten about. But, you mentioned red flag laws, and I think that there's a good argument to go either way. They don't do enough. They go too far. But I think that, red flag laws are probably a good jumping off point for a discussion. And I know Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has talked about the fact that they would be discussed. President Trump has talked about these red flag laws. I think I looked up because I wasn't sure how many states had actually enacted them. So it's 16, and then 2 are scheduled to start red flag. I guess it will be enacted in 2020, and I think it was Hawaii and Nevada. And I know my state of Florida currently has red flag laws, although that's not what they're called on the books. So, again, I think you're absolutely right when you say that this is about more than just violent video games. We're like you compared it to a fig leaf, and I think that's exactly what's happening. It's not about one reform or pointing the finger in one direction or blaming one particular thing. This is something that's comprehensive, and this is something that's been going on for decades in this country, and it's it seems to be getting worse. And it's impossible to I feel it's impossible to point your finger and say this is the problem, because I think that's what we try to do as human beings. I think we look for a solution because it's easy for us.
Sure.
And I don't know that there is one solution for this or one cause.
Well, I mean, I think that the solution is pretty clear. Is that we have over, I think, 300 million guns in this country. Well over that actually, and if we had a lot fewer guns, we'd have a lot fewer, a lot less gun violence. But that's not a viable solution. We're not going to, even if we banned, even if reinstituted a new assault weapons ban, it's not like the assault weapons that are out there, or assault style weapons that are out there, would be confiscated. Even if the government tried to do that, it just wouldn't be very effective. Not that I think it would even happen. So we have all of these guns out there. They're going to stay out there. We have all of these high capacity magazines, which to me, that's the bigger issue. I don't really, to me, it doesn't seem to matter what a semi-automatic weapon looks like. They
Right.
all work the same way, whether it looks like an AK-47 or it looks like whatever, a squirt gun or something. I mean, you press the trigger once and a round goes downrange. That's how a semi-automatic weapon works. And so I think a lot of people don't really get that. But again, the issue to me is it's just we're stuck with this system. I think in a saner world, guns would be treated like cars. You'd have to pass a competency test, get a license, renew that license on a regular basis, and have liability insurance. And if you don't have proof of insurance, you can't buy a gun or a magazine or rounds or anything like that. But that's never going to happen. I think of all that, I think the solution that makes the most sense to me is that maybe could get the most purchase is the liability insurance thing, because then it takes the onus off of government and puts it on the private sector. So it's not the government telling you, what you need to do with all these regulations. It's insurers saying, hey, you want a lower rate? Well, then you better have, gun safety classes or things like that. That's a much more market-based solution that I think could get at least some conservatives on board. But even so, I mean, I have no illusions about this. There's actually legislation out there, the Firearm Risk Protection Act of 2019, Representative Maloney from New York, but it's not going anywhere because nothing comprehensive is going anywhere because a lot of people own guns and they are very vehement, and there's just not the political will to do anything that's going to matter. And also, when we talk about our gun problem, these tragedies are awful, but our real gun problem is the suicide and the gun crime problem. Not so much the mass shooting problem, though that's horrific. It's what makes the news, but the vast bulk, I think almost 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides. And so that's the real problem. And of course, people have mental health issues everywhere, but uniquely in the United States, among almost all developed countries, is they have access to a method of suicide that tends to be far more effective. And so if they happen to be momentarily depressed or in, chemically induced state or something, well, there's no going back for that. So again, to me, it comes back to nothing's going to happen. I would be stunned if anything that mattered is going to happen. And, Mitch McConnell was politically smart to say, hey, we'll look at this, but we're going to take some time, because he understands the issue attention cycle. He knows that the public is going to move on from this. We moved on from Las Vegas, 50-something dead. We moved on from kids being mowed down in schools. I mean, people are going to move on from this too, and he knows it, and that's going to be the end of it, and it stinks as far as I'm concerned, but that's how it is.
Yeah, and I think that there are a lot of things that can't be addressed by any sort of measure. Things like stolen guns, guns illegally smuggled. For example, there have been plenty of mass shootings where the perpetrator built the gun or modified a gun. Obviously after Las Vegas, I remember that was the morning after the Las Vegas shooting. That was actually my first day at work in my old job in a newsroom. And I remember just being stunned by how quickly that, we're all aware of it, but working in a newsroom, you see how quickly that news cycle travels. And it was there were people on the right and people on the left who were pointing to what happened and saying, we need to pay attention to this months after it happened. And we seem to have forgotten, our collective consciousness just sort of drifted to something else. It was Me Too, or it was, something, the election, the midterms, whatever. So, and I'm not saying these things aren't worthy. They're they're all worthy and they're all worth paying attention to. But, I feel like every time something like this happens, we have an opportunity at best to open up sort of a national dialogue, and we fail to do it. And, I think, I have issues with red flag legislation. I don't really see too many people coming forward with alternatives, things that sort of bridge the gap between mental health and gun ownership. People on both sides have talked about strengthening restricting people who have had mental health issues. I know there are possibly some constitutional issues with that. Libertarians aren't fond of that. I actually know Democrats and Republicans who aren't fond of red flag laws for various reasons, but I'm just not sure that there's anything else worth talking about on the table. I'm not saying they should or shouldn't be enacted at, on a broader scale, but I'm saying it's worth a conversation. And I hope that in some way this sticks, because I think it's something that we do need to talk about and something we do need to address. But I do also think we need to address things like mental health. I think we need to address the legal system and treatment of individuals who have experienced mental health issues, because the one thing that does keep popping up is that there were always warning signs, right? I mean, this week we were inundated with stories about the El Paso shooter and the Dayton shooter. Both of them had, there were warning signs. Classmates had come forward, teachers. I think a guidance counselor came forward, parents. I think in the case of the El Paso shooter, who was actually from the Dallas area, his mother had called just days before the shooting to tell the police that she was concerned. He had ordered this AK-style rifle, and she was concerned that he wasn't mature enough or I guess mentally fit to have this rifle, and it was sort of brushed aside. Right. So I think there are so many different conversations that we need to be having, including things like gun control, mental health, legal system. We're not paying attention to enough. And we have enough to pay attention to, yes, but this is very important. And I think, those of us who are parents, we obviously have some pretty strong concerns about it. I think I can't say that a day goes by and I don't think about it. Sure. It's frightening.
I just think in the end, that the bottom line is the more freedom we give people to possess instruments of death, the more people are going to die. And that's the trade-off. And anyone who doesn't admit that is being fundamentally dishonest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. And of course, just sort of talking about some of the things that have come up, in the past week after these shootings are some of the, I guess, ideological issues, things like white supremacy. One of the things that particularly bothered me, I'm sure you felt the same way, Mike, is that there was this effort on both sides to point the finger in the other direction, because you had one shooter who maintained this sort of white supremacist ideology. The shooter in El Paso was a pretty staunch Second Amendment advocate, and he had some white supremacist leanings. And these were things that I think he was 21 years old. They dated back to high school, which it should have been an alarm bell, But we talked a lot about that this week. And of course, in Dayton, there were allegations that the shooter had some Antifa leanings. Either way, very violent rhetoric. And of course, I think there were a lot of barbs thrown either way. That disturbed me, because I think it just deepened the divide.
Yeah, well, I think, the Dayton thing seems to be a lot sketchier, but it seems entirely clear that on the El Paso side, there was a manifesto of sorts and so forth. So that seemed to me to be absolutely clear. And then that gets, like you said, in that whole thing of white supremacy, white nationalism. And of course, a number of Democratic presidential candidates came out and said flat out that they think Donald Trump is a white supremacist. I know Elizabeth Warren and Beto O'Rourke said that. I think that's taking it a bit too far. Or at least, I guess I'll say, I think there's insufficient evidence to conclude that Donald Trump is a white supremacist, at least as I understand the terms. To me, white supremacist is someone who believes that the white race, so to speak, is, superior to all the other races and therefore should rule over them. A white nationalist, on the other hand, is somebody who wants to sort of maintain a white national identity in the United States. And there, I think you could make a much better case for Donald Trump falling into that camp than the white supremacist camp. But honestly, I think that's it's tough to determine that either way. But what it isn't tough is that when you have a manifesto that mentions the invasion of the Mexicans, and you have a president who repeatedly talks about the invasion, a guy who says, I'll do whatever is necessary to stop the invasion of our country. It's like a war, like there's a foreign invasion. When there's a rally in Florida where somebody says, shoot them, and the president just smiles and says, only in the panhandle can you get away with that statement. I mean, are you kidding? And people argue that he's not normalizing this sort of thing. I get it. He's at these rallies and he's basking in the adulation of all of these fans, and so they say stuff and it gets them worked up, and he just feels the God love seems like the wrong word, but he feels the emotion and the passion and he goes with it. And I don't think he cares that he's stoking it, because he just loves the feeling of all those people directing their adulation, and that's the only thing that matters to Donald Trump, as far as I can tell.
This has been a tough week for everybody, but in these moments where we're all feeling very low and we're looking to these places and these communities that have just been ravaged, I wish that, and I know that I won't get anywhere with this wish, but I wish that we would all come together and that we would all tone down violent rhetoric. And that includes people on my own side, on the right side, on the left side. And that's just not what I'm seeing. There are a lot of things and statements that President Trump makes that I think he could rephrase, or I think he could reword or rethink. And I think you gave a really good example of that. And I do think that all sort of violent rhetoric and this pointed hatred towards the other, so to speak, and the other side stoke these flames. And of course, we'll get into the whole Castro doxing on Twitter thing. I think that didn't help matters. But I see this coming from both sides. I see a lot of violent rhetoric coming from both sides. This idea that Democrats are going to take the White House in 2020 and they're going to get payback, for this win in 2016 and everything that's transpired. I don't see this as a Donald Trump problem as much as I see this as an everybody problem. Although I do think Donald Trump needs to tone down his rhetoric from time to time, I also think other people on the right and on the left need to tone down the rhetoric, because I don't think that any of this is helping. I don't think Donald Trump, making some of the, sort of goading this on at his rallies is helping. I don't think that Elizabeth Warren and Beto O'Rourke, pointing fingers and calling, people white supremacists and making these allegations that, donors in districts and Texas are white supremacist supporters. I don't think that's helping. So again, I think this needs to be part of a bigger conversation that we're having about the divide that we're dealing with. I don't think anything's going to happen with that. I wish it would.
Well, I certainly don't disagree, but I think there's a bit of a false equivalency here. I mean, especially given the fact that the president of the United States is the person who is the, supposed to be the kind of our exemplar of moral rectitude and the symbol of our country and so forth. So the president, I don't think it's at all unreasonable to hold the president of the United States to the highest standard, higher than certainly random presidential candidates or senators or representatives or whoever happens to be the pundit of the week. And yet the president of the United States, the current occupant of the White House, has been a dismal failure in being an ethical or moral exemplar for anything. And so I think it's, while you're certainly not incorrect in saying that, hey, everyone could do a little bit better, we should be able to, we should demand far, far more of our president than any other political leader. And in this, he's been a disgrace.
I would agree with you to a certain extent. But I'm going to stick with my original comment, which is that the divisiveness that's going on is the responsibility of both parties. And I do think it's up to party leadership. Now, I have to give credit to Nancy Pelosi in a lot of ways. She's done a pretty good job sometimes of trying to sort of quell the tempers on her side. Again, we've talked about before on this show when you and I have co-hosted that she is a savvy politician and she understands rhetoric better than a lot of people who are in Congress. And I think she understands that there's a lot of harm in this rhetoric. Now, this is not to say, because I know people will say, but wait a minute, you're not bringing up Donald Trump. I am bringing up Donald Trump. I think that Donald Trump should be held accountable for the things he says and for, the flames he stokes. Obviously, you have, somebody in El Paso who was inspired by some of the things he said and some of the language and rhetoric going on. And I think that's wrong. And I think there needs to be accountability there. But I think that, I don't think it's necessarily one side that's culpable. I think it's both sides. And I think I get frustrated when people sort of point fingers either way, not at me necessarily, but in either direction and say, it's your fault. It's your fault. I just feel like it gets us nowhere. And I think, as a Republican, I think it's important for us to stand up and say, we have to take responsibility for this. We have to tone down our rhetoric. And, the president is a Republican and we need to take ownership and responsibility for that. And so everybody on our side needs to tone down the rhetoric. And I think people on the left need to do the same. But unfortunately, I don't see that happening. I don't see this, this sort of dissipating anytime soon. And, it takes something like a national tragedy like this to make us realize just how deep this divide is. It should be doing the opposite. It should be uniting us and bringing us together. I think that the intention, I think there are good intentions out there, but I think they're just quashed by people who are inflaming these tempers.
Sure, absolutely, and I would say those people are led by the president, who I would argue is the most polarizing president I've seen in my lifetime, and in a long time, maybe even before that. So, but in terms of substantively what's happening, it seems to me to be pretty clear that far-right domestic terrorism is on the rise, though maybe not quite as much as some statistics might suggest because of better reporting in recent years, but even so, seems to be pretty clearly on the rise. And so now I think we should at least expect that Congress and the administration focus more resources on combating this. If you take a look at President Obama's last year in office, DHS funded anti-extremist groups to the tune of around $21 million. Last year, I believe in 2017, Donald Trump's DHS, $3 million. Now, that might in part be because some of these anti-extremist groups are seen as pro-liberal, but I think the larger point is that we need to find a way to really start working on this problem and directing a lot more federal law enforcement resources to this. And it's a tough problem because it's not like back in the 50s and 60s when, the FBI kind of cut the legs out from under the Klan by essentially the old joke was you went to a Klan meeting and there were more FBI agents than there were Klan members. Right. But now it's like these little cesspools of hate, like the 8chan and the other groups like that. So it's not like there's organized meetings and these are lone wolf type of things and so forth. So it's a lot harder thing to figure out and to deal with. And, we'll really know how much the administration cares about this as a problem and sees it as a problem when we see what sort of resources they're directing toward it. Or if they're going to take the Tucker Carlson line, like, well, white nationalism is just a hoax, like the Russia thing, that to me is ridiculous and irresponsible. And we'll see when if the money goes to it, that whether or not the administration seems to agree with that position.
Yeah. I think that, there are, rather than attack sides, because I don't think that any logical Republican or logical Democrat out there would want to claim a group like Antifa or would want to claim white supremacists. But the truth is that these groups exist and they commit these horrendous acts and they inspire people to commit these lone wolf types, and, mental stability conversation aside, this is something that we need to address. If they're spreading these ideologies of hate, it's just like you said, it's become too easy with the internet and with social media. And again, I don't think, recently we had a law to limit social media and to put, restrictions in place on social media. I think that was Hawley out of Missouri, I believe. But, I don't think that that's the answer either. But again, I think this needs to be a national conversation. How do we address this without pointing fingers at the other side? Because nobody seems to want to take ownership for what's on quote unquote their side. And it's not politically advantageous to do so, but nobody wants to claim these groups. So let's have a conversation about these groups and let's decide what we're going to do with them.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So should we move on to the next topic?
Sure.
Okay. So the next topic that we wanted to talk about is something a little more policy focused. And of course, with all the news of the shootings, this was sort of a close number 2 in the news. But it's something that didn't get a lot of attention until later in the week. And that's this past Monday, the U.S. did something that it hasn't done in a while. The Treasury Department declared China a currency manipulator. And this is interesting because this hasn't happened since the 1990s. And back in the 1990s, it was actually China that had earned the title. So to sort of set the scene for all this, it went down in the midst of deteriorating trade relations and President Trump's decision to impose additional tariffs on Chinese goods. And this has also been something that's sort of been circling the drain for a while. Then candidate president, I guess he wasn't president yet, then candidate Trump often spoke of China as a possible currency manipulator. This was back in 2016. And the Treasury Department has said that that they had kept the nation on a currency watch list for the past few years. And of course, there are plenty of points and counterpoints. Critics are arguing that the decision could escalate things, lead to a U.S.-China trade war. And others argue that this could, on the flip side, level the trade playing field. And repercussions would be felt in China and not in the U.S. So I'm seeing a lot of back and forth, but I know this is something that you really wanted to talk about, Mike. So I want to make sure to give you the mic.
Yeah, absolutely, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around this whole idea of currency manipulation. I think a lot of people don't quite understand what it is or why it matters. And first off, I should say there's no question that China had been a currency manipulator, but actually they more or less stopped doing that around 2013. So, back then we could have legitimately labeled them a currency manipulator, but we didn't. And now when China has actually been doing more to prop up its currency, we're now saying that they're trying to devalue, when really this current devaluation, almost all economists would tell you, has been driven much more by markets than by the Chinese government. So for one thing, the designation is just flat out wrong. It doesn't really mean a whole lot in theory. It doesn't lead to anything except there need to be some, I guess, talks after that designation is made. But it doesn't do a whole lot. And I think what maybe the basics of this essentially is, if you have a weak currency, and this is the argument, is that China is trying to weaken its currency. And the advantage of having a weaker currency is that it helps your exports. It makes your exports more affordable to other countries. And so a lot of people, China, they're an export-driven economy, so therefore they're going to make their currency weak, and that will help them out. But of course, there's no such thing as a free lunch. That hurts your imports, and it also means you get less outside investment. And so conversely, if you have a strong currency, more outside investment, it hurts your exports, it helps your imports. So a lot of this, I think, is based on this idea that China is almost entirely export driven. A lot of people think that. Well, that used to be true. This week I dug into the World Bank stats, which keeps all kinds of stats, economic stats on, all the countries in the world, all 195 of them, I think it is. And, as recently as around a decade ago, China's exports accounted for somewhere around over a third of its entire GDP, which is a lot. But actually, in the most recent year we have data for, which I believe is 2017, China's exports were only 19.5% of their GDP. That's lower than all but 33 of the 195 countries in the world. In other words, almost every country in the world has more of their economy based on exports than China's did. I was stunned by that. I double checked just to make sure that was right. But so China is predominantly not export driven, despite what people might think. And I think it makes sense to understand why that would happen because China has an enormous domestic economy, right? And they have a
Hmm.
lot, I mean, if like almost 4 times as many people as the United States. So in that case, because they're not so export driven as they used to be, they're not going to be as interested in keeping their currency weak. And so I think a lot of times when people think about China, they're thinking about China under an old paradigm, but China's been changing really rapidly over the last, well, really since around 2000 when they became part of the WTO and basically the world kind of economic system. And
Hmm.
so that to me is a big part of it. Now, of course, the US is even less export driven than China. The US actually is lower than all but 8 countries in the world in the percentage of its GDP that's export driven. So that's one of the big things I wanted to get across is that the world that you think you might have known in terms of what China is like, that world has changed an awful lot in a very short amount of time. So that's the main point I wanted to make here. And of course, I think another important point is that Donald Trump has been pushing an awful lot for the Fed to lower interest rates, and really that's kind of an indirect form of currency manipulation because the higher your interest rates, the more people want your currency, which makes your currency stronger. That pulls in investments, but it hurts your exports. And so it's just the opposite when you lower your interest rates. So Donald Trump wants to do some currency manipulation too, but he just doesn't want to, he doesn't want to maybe call it as such. So yeah, and so the general point I think is that it sounds like, well, currency manipulation bad, but I think there's just a lot of misunderstanding around the entire topic. And granted, international trade and finance is hugely complicated. I know whenever I talk about it to students, I see the eyes glaze over and so forth.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to kind of get this information out there so people might have a better context for understanding some of this stuff.
Well, one of the easiest ways that I've ever heard it described before, and I think it makes a lot of sense to people who aren't economists. I'm not an economist. I mean, most people, are, even political types, aren't economists. Is the idea that every country, to some extent, engages in currency manipulation. Everything is an act of currency manipulation, and therefore, because everything is, nothing is. Sort of a thing,
Right, right.
and I think that in a way, I mean, it's a little bit Twilight Zone-y, I guess you could say, but I think it's the best way to frame this argument. I do think it's important that we bring some of these issues, foreign exchange rates, balances of trade, to focus. I think they're legitimate government concerns for the U.S. and for other nations as well. But like you said, this issue is so complex. I mean, you've got people in the Trump administration saying that the currency devalued overnight. It was very, very quick. I think it raised a lot of alarms for a lot of people. And a lot of people involved in the Treasury Department said that it violated China's G20 commitment to refrain from competitive devaluation. But again, if you look at it in a bigger frame, you think to yourself, what is this going to do? What is tacking on extra tariffs going to do?
Yeah.
And, I think it remains to be seen, but I think you make some really good points. And I also think it's something that people need to keep an eye on. I think people tend to kind of tune out things like currency manipulation, these big financial issues. Again, we're not economists, but I think it's definitely worth paying attention to.
Well, and you mentioned tariffs, and of course, another
Mm-hmm.
point I want to make about that is tariffs are not just a tax; they're a regressive tax. If the iPhone, say, that you wanted to buy before the tariffs was $800 and it ends up being $880, that means a lot more to someone who's making, say, 50 grand a year than it does to someone making $500,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no question that these tariffs are going to be felt by American consumers, and they're going to be felt the most by the consumers that are at the lower end of the economic spectrum. And I've said this a number of times. You can even make a principled case for doing this. It's pretty clear that the Trump administration's public position of trade wars are good and easy to win is just ridiculous. But that's not to say that trade wars might not occasionally be worthwhile. I'm not entirely convinced, but you could say, well, hey, if we could be willing to suck it up and take a little bit pain that's maybe felt more by some people than others, certainly. But if the final result is sort of a reset playing field that's fairer to the United States, maybe long term that's worth the sacrifice. But that's not the argument that anyone's making in public. But I think that's the reality of it. And I wish that the administration just had the guts to make the honest argument for it.
I think tariffs have worked from time to time. The Trump administration has certainly engaged in tariffs, trying to keep companies from going overseas, for example, trying to keep companies staying here on U.S. soil. I think to some extent it's worked, but like you said, the long-term idea behind tariffs is that you're going to sort of level the playing field and make things easier for Americans in the long run. But we are short-sighted and tariffs don't always work. And so I think this is a big risk on the part of the Trump administration.
Yeah.
Just like I thought that, sort of forcing companies' hands like Ford moving to Mexico versus staying in the United States. I thought that was risky. Sometimes it's paid off and sometimes it hasn't. And in the Trump administration, you just never know. This is a guy who likes to take risks, and he surrounded himself by people who like to take risks. So, I think it'll remain a question mark until we see the ultimate outcome, and it may take a long time. But I think it's worth putting a pin in and talking about.
Yeah, and of course, it's pretty clear that President Trump is certainly he's not a conservative. He's certainly not a libertarian either, because the
No.
libertarian, position would be, hey, if they want to move to Mexico, that's
Let
great.
'em.
We should
Yeah.
we should let them, because
Yeah.
that way we won't propping up our businesses that can't be competitive, and through the process of creative destruction and whatnot, we can create even bigger and better businesses and so forth. But that's not an argument that's going to play too well. Certainly not in the industrial manufacturing states.
No. And as somebody who sort of strides the line with libertarianism from time to time, I've definitely had some of those questions in my head, especially, when that was happening closer to the beginning of his term. So anyway, should we move on? Because we have a couple more topics to talk about. Yeah. Okay. So the next topic that we're going to talk about is the ICE raids. This past Wednesday, hundreds of immigration officials raided 7 plants across the state of Mississippi, and these 7 plants were operated by 4 companies. The search warrant stated that there was suspicion that these companies willfully and unlawfully employed undocumented workers. This was one of the largest stings in more than a decade. 680 people in total were arrested. And shortly after that, more than half remained in ICE custody, while about 300 were released. And once the dust cleared, immigration officials said that these workers, most were formerly residing in other states, had obtained employment cards in these plants. In some cases, stolen identities were used, which is pretty common. The companies could face serious legal consequences for these hires, and that includes jail time or, more likely, very stiff fines. Law enforcement and some state officials have stated that they were merely investigating the companies over the course of years and enforcing immigration law. And then, of course, on the flip side, local church leaders, activists, and local elected officials, in some cases, have gathered to support families of the detained workers, particularly children and spouses. And many have called the raids dehumanizing and inhumane. So, there was quite a bit of back and forth about this about midweek. And of course, this was the largest raid in over a decade. I think there have been raids that were larger on single companies, but it's been well over 10 years.
Yeah. What a completely backwards approach to this whole problem. I think it shines a light on the real problem. And the real problem to me is that we have a lot of jobs that you just cannot find anyone but undocumented workers to do. And so they're doing them. They're being hired to do these jobs. I mean, we have incredibly low unemployment. Basically, if you want a job, almost you can find it. So employers are having more trouble in many cases hiring people for low skill than for high skill jobs. And so where are these people coming from? Well, they're undocumented workers. And the thing about this is Mississippi has one of the stronger E-Verify systems in the country, which points out how many holes there are in this.
Yeah.
It's easy to submit fake documentation. Social Security Administration has estimated that close to 2 million immigrants are working with fake or stolen Social Security cards, and that number is just rising. We don't have any kind of a decent visa program for low skilled workers. We need these people to help our economy. These people are vital for our economy, and yet they're only the EB3 visa program, which is essentially
Hmm.
for low skilled workers, limited to I believe 5,000 people. I mean that's just insane. We need so many people to do these jobs that they're actually, and this idea that they're jobs that Americans would be getting is just has been debunked time and time again.
Hmm.
So I think number one, we need to figure out a way to have like a guest worker program for these low skill jobs. There are programs like that for seasonal work, agricultural, and other things, but they're not nearly big enough, I would argue. Not only that, but when we need to make e-verify much stronger. We need to make it dead simple for employers, old employers. I mean, like an app on your phone, simple and
Hmm.
much more foolproof. And that's going to require a lot of money. But I think it's just critically important for our economy. And not only that, but when companies hire these folks illegally, there should be real fines. The fines on the companies are laughable. It certainly
Hmm.
destroys the families, as
Yeah.
we've seen. But the companies, these are in many cases billion-dollar companies, and
Yeah.
the fines can be like a couple $100s to a few $1,000s. Companies laugh this stuff off. So if we were really serious about this, we would attack it from that angle. But there are a lot of advantages for big businesses to hire undocumented workers, because if you look at the kind of conditions these folks are forced to work under, they have no recourse because they're told, hey, you complain, you're going to be booted out of the country. They oftentimes don't speak the language, don't have anyone they can go to. It's a great advantage for unscrupulous employers, and there are plenty of them,
Hmm.
especially in the agricultural sector, where it's just sickening how people are treated. But this is the kind of, I would think, common sense reform that's not going to happen because there are too many business interests that say, you know what? Hey, we could talk a good game, but we like having workers who don't have any power over us, where we can essentially do what we want with them. And I think that's where we need to focus.
Right. I was actually going to make your point that these companies you're working with, multi-million, billion-dollar companies, Coke Foods, Pearl River Foods. I mean, these are in a lot of places household
Yeah.
names. These are huge companies that have thousands, if not tens of thousands of workers, and a lot of them are undocumented. And I was reading about this because I wanted to know how much these like supposedly stiff fines were going to be. It's $3,000 a worker. So if, for example, one of these big companies has 200 workers or 300 workers that are detained, that's $3,000 per worker. I mean, in the end, that's not going to affect their bottom line very much. They're going to pay, and this is what happens. I mean, I know that this happens. This has been happening for decades, and I don't think anybody wants to talk about it. It's a bit of a dirty secret, but these companies will pay the fines. They don't see jail time. I mean, that's, you're not going to, put these business
Yeah.
people in these overcrowded we've got a problem there. These overcrowded jails is very expensive. And so, you give them you levy these fines, they pay them, and then they go about their business and they hire more undocumented workers. And those undocumented workers are subjected to these, terrible conditions, and they're crossing state lines. And I think, when we've talked about this, I think that this is one of these areas where bipartisanship can work, because I think
Yeah.
that there are sane, rational, logical people on both sides who see that this is a real problem. And, the thing that always gets me are these stories. And I know that they're designed to pull at the heartstrings, but they're truth of these
Yeah.
families, these children who are separated from their parents. I know, as somebody who is a Christian and somebody who has a heart and a family, I donated to 2 churches this week who were doing outreach with the children of some of the people who were detained, and some of the families, and I think it's important that we step up and we say that this is a system that doesn't work. And again, I don't want to say I'm hopeless about it. I don't like being negative, but to some extent, I think I am, because I know the truth of it is that these big companies are going to just keep paying these fines, and we're just going to keep hiring these undocumented workers. It's a tough situation, but creating a better pathway for these workers, particularly in agricultural fields, particularly in I know California is fraught with problems, but Texas also has a lot of problems.
Sure.
Even across the Midwest, I know the largest single raid on a company took place in Iowa. This isn't something that's relegated to border states. This is something everybody's dealing with. And I think we need to open up that line of communication and come to some sort of a bipartisan conclusion about what we're going to do to make it easier for these people, because then that would give them an opportunity to have some recourse if they don't get paid, or if their conditions are unsanitary or unsafe or something like that. I mean, we have to be able to give them that much.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that certainly the way to move forward is not going to be focusing on evil businesses, framing it that way. And so the way I would frame it is to say our current system has put businesses in an impossible situation.
Absolutely.
They need workers to do these things. They cannot find enough legal workers with correct paperwork to do them. So what do you expect them to do? To just say, well, okay, I guess we're not going to process any more food, or we're not going to pick any more whatever. I mean, that's totally unreasonable. And so we need a visa system that meets the need of our businesses in this country. And we're failing our businesses in a dramatic fashion by not providing that system. And that means, unlike the president's called for reforms, which focus on high-skilled workers, we need a lot more low-skilled workers to be able to come legally to this country and do the work that they're already doing, but now under the table, not part of the system, and so where they can be mistreated. And I would think that in a slightly better world, people could get behind this, both Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, I'd have to agree on that, definitely. But yeah, I mean, this is one of those things. Again, we'll keep watching to see what comes of this. I don't have a lot of hope, but maybe there's a glimmer there. There have been some representatives and senators who have stepped forward and said this is something we need to work on. Now, if anything happens, I guess we'll be talking about it again on an upcoming show. But
I'm not hopeful either, for the reason that I think the only way to make this work would be to say we're going to massively increase the number of low-skilled, low-educated, Central and Central American workers that we're going to allow into this country. Can you see that?
No.
Getting anywhere? Yeah,
no.
Exactly.
No,
exactly.
Because I think we have people on two extremes who don't see the benefit of yes, these people need to be legal, and it's as much for them as it is for, the United States government. We have to be able to vet these people to some extent, and we have to be able to account for them. But at the same time, and I think that's something that a lot of logical Republicans will say. It's certainly something that I say. But on the other hand, we have to be able to give them recourse if something happens, if something goes wrong, and we have to, give them the opportunity to be able to speak on their own behalf and to be with their families and not live in fear of suddenly going through deportation and being separated from their family. So, I think you can, I think something like that, if we were to really be honest about it and put politics aside, I chuckle when I say that sort of internally, but if we were able to do that, we could see that this would not only benefit us, but it would benefit these workers and their families, and it would be a win-win-win.
Yes,
but
exactly.
But we're not there.
No, not even close.
Yeah. So I guess should we move on to the last topic?
I know there's that one more story that we wanted to cover. Absolutely. Yeah.
We got one more story. And again, this was something that was a real hot topic all week, kind of off and on. On Tuesday, Representative Joaquin Castro of San Antonio, Texas, he's the brother of Democratic presidential candidate Julian Castro, tweeted a list of names and businesses or employers of 44 people in San Antonio. So this includes people who would presumably be his constituents, who donated the maximum amount allowable under federal law, which is $2,800 to the Trump campaign. These people included prominent local business owners as well as retired people and some others. Democrats, including Representative Rashida Tlaib and Castro's brother Julian, voiced support. And this immediately caught the attention, of course, of those on the right who immediately called it doxing, dog whistling, and in some cases unethical. Several Republican lawmakers are calling on ethics investigations over this retweeted list, while Castro and supporters argue that the information was public record anyway. So this is something that was popping up. And it was funny because I saw it circulating on sort of right-wing news sources. It's sad I even have to qualify and say left-wing, right-wing. But this is, it was making more headway and getting more traction. And by midweek, I was seeing it on just about every mainstream outlet, which I thought was interesting. But I don't know. What's your take on it, Mike?
Oh, those sensitive snowflakes on the right who can't handle being outed by somebody actually going to the publicly available FEC website, typing in a zip code and getting a list of donors, which I just did just yesterday. So I found out who the max donors in my zip code were. It's a pretty poor zip code, so there aren't too many of them. But I mean, to me, this is just so ridiculous. How retransmitting publicly available data, and not just buried in some archive, but stuff that you can literally get in 20 seconds by going to fec.gov and then typing in a zip code or a name or an industry. That, to me, this points out that people who say they're for transparency in campaign finance, in a lot of cases, are only for it in theory. Sure, transparent, so long as no one actually bothers to look up the information or it's not publicized. So I know that you could technically say, find out who I gave money to, but no one's going to do that, so it doesn't matter. But if you did it, oh my gosh, you're calling me out. That's to me, it's just ridiculous.
So here's the issue that I have with it. And I do think that there are a lot of people on the right who are being a bit, shall we say, snowflakey about this whole issue, and I think snowflakes exist on the right as much as on the left. But I think that some of the issues that I took with this were my very first question when I first saw this, and I actually saw it on my Twitter feed. So I feel like I got this. I like making up my own mind, and I saw this because I follow Joaquin Castro on Twitter, and the first thing I thought was, what is his goal here? What's his purpose of doing this? I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, right with it. I'm just wondering what his purpose is. And I did think about doxing, dog whistling. Is that what's going on here? And I said, you know what, I'm going to see what he says about it, because he really didn't say much. Accompanying the tweet, he had some comments about these people supporting ideologies that call Hispanic immigrants invaders. Then I took another step back and I said, that language is reminding me of something. So the word invaders was actually used in the El Paso Shooters Manifesto. Mm-hmm. So then I thought to myself, is Joaquin Castro trying to draw a link between these people who donated to the Trump campaign and the shooter? And I'm not, yeah. I think he was. I think he was too. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you entirely. I mean, I think what he's doing is, because the first thing I did, the same thing that you did, I don't follow him on Twitter, but I read the tweet. And for people who haven't, the original tweet said, sad to see so many San Antonians as 2019 maximum donors to Donald Trump, the owner of Bill Miller Barbecue, owner of Historic Pearl, realtor Phyllis Browning, etc. Their contributions are fueling a campaign of hate that labels Hispanic immigrants as invaders. And so I don't see how you cannot say, well, it seems to me the only logical conclusion is that he wants people to see all those names, and there was that attached, graphic with the complete list.
Right.
But basically saying, well, okay, that these people are supporting the sort of hate that leads to these shootings. So therefore, maybe we should think twice about going to Phyllis Browning for our realty needs, or going to Bill Miller's Barbecue or something like that. So it's kind of an indirect way of calling for some sort of an economic response to people who are doing this. In other words, I mean, otherwise he wouldn't have just prominently mentioned, specific businesses in the text of the tweet. So I think that's absolutely his intention. And I don't see anything wrong with it. I mean, when you donate money to a campaign, that's going to be, if it's over $50, it's going to be public record. And that's our campaign finance law. And if you can't take the heat, maybe you shouldn't donate to the campaign.
So I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, before anybody accuses me of being a snowflake, I want to make it clear the fact that he published these names. First of all, I'm not one of his constituents. I'm not somebody who donated the maximum allowable amount to the Trump campaign. I guess you could say that this doesn't affect me directly. Nor do I think, I'm obviously one of my favorite topics to talk about, and I used to talk about it a lot, is the idea of campaign finance reform. And I understand that all this information is public record, and I understand that you can find it fairly easily if you just look a little bit for it. It doesn't take a long amount of time. But one of the things that bothered me about this is the fact that you have these business owners, and these are businesses, local businesses. I Googled a few of them that have been in this area for a long time. You have people working at these businesses who are supporting families. You have people working at these businesses who maybe don't vote the same way that the owner of the business does. And I have to wonder what his ultimate goal was, or even if he thought it through, that he would be affecting these businesses in this way, and that he would be affecting so many people. I mean, we're talking about people who are his constituents. And while I understand that this is the America that we're living in, sadly, and that this is what it's come to, I've seen people do this before on the right and on the left, this sort of like doxing, if that's what you want. I don't know, the calling people out, whatever you want to call it. This happens a lot.
Sure.
But I don't know that I've seen, at least not recently, somebody come out and do it to their own constituents. And I think that rather than look at this as like, well, you're a snowflake. Well, no, I'm not being a snowflake. I think it's more important to see that there are bigger ramifications here to what he's done. And again, I go back to my original question when I first saw it, and I didn't tweet about it. I kind of lurk on Twitter, but I didn't look at anybody's responses or anything like that. I thought to myself, what's the goal? It wasn't that I hated it or I loved it or anything. It was just, what's the goal here? What's he trying to accomplish here? And I think, as the dust settles on this one, I'll continue asking that. What was his goal? And will there be repercussions? Will these businesses go out of business? Will there be families affected by this? Or is this just an attempt to, like you said, present this information that's already public?
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of repercussions, they're going to be essentially vanishingly small. None of these businesses are going to go out of it. It might have a small, tiny little, for a short period of time, downtick. But again, I don't know what Castro's Twitter following is, or how many people are even real people, as opposed to kind of very politically involved people like us are really even, heard about much of this. And, I think it's easy for us to forget, for all of us to forget, because even if you're listening to this podcast, you're almost certainly more politically involved and astute than probably, 80, 90% of the public. And, real people in the real world, most of this stuff, they just never even hear it because they're like, oh God, it's just those politicians
it's noise.
and pundits. Yeah, noise, exactly. So I don't think it's going to have much of a difference at all, really. So to me, it's kind of a flash in the pan sort of thing when it comes to real implications, especially given the fact that we have such an incredibly strong job market right now, and that if there were to be any implications, which I don't think there are, it's not like getting a job is all that difficult these days for most folks. But again, I don't think that's going to have any kind of I don't see much coming of it for sure.
Okay. Well, I think it's definitely, again, like all these stories this week, that we have a lot to watch in the coming weeks. And I'm sure we'll be circling back to these again on another episode that you and I co-host. So, we'll see.
But we've got more to talk about. We're going to have to leave that, though, for the bonus show for folks who are Patreon supporters. And I think we'll be talking about, the Peter Strzok and Andrew McCabe filing suit against the Department of Justice, right? Because of they're saying it's politically motivated dismissals, I think it is. And I hadn't heard about this. Is kind of an interesting thing, that proposed law that would make it a felony to throw water on New York City police officers, which is really kind of an interesting thing. And I'm really looking forward to talking about that with you. So, folks, if you're a supporter, if I'm doing my job, it should be in your podcast app by the time you hear this. And of course, that's just one of the supporter-only things we have for you. To check them all out, go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can go to politicsguys.com/support. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can do that at mail@politicsguys.com. There's also our Facebook page, which recently, especially with the gun stuff, has just blown up, I got to say. It's facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. guys. If you're not already a subscriber to the show, it would be really great if you could. That helps us out. And also, if you could just let folks know, through word of mouth that this is a great show to listen to, we would appreciate that. It's the best advertising. And also maybe leaving a review or a rating on your podcast app of choice. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Benji Fishman, and Andra Masker. Today's show is produced by Krista Matheny and Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.